and coalition building at the CDP, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy based in New York. He will be introducing the organization very shortly. And we also have on the panel the founder and CEO of HVFC International, a consultancy firm based in the Netherlands. Before going over to Sharad, Han, could you please a couple of words introducing HVFC and the reasons for this webinar?
Yeah, of course, and thank you, Kenneth, for that, and thank you, Sharad, for being here, and welcome to all the participants. It's always a great pleasure to see many of you taking the time to listen to this. And a quick introduction before we go to Sharad, who is actually the main person to listen to. Now, we decided earlier this year as HVFC to organize more webinars, because we saw that the world is changing rapidly in the sense of fundraising going down with many of the traditional donors, and we noticed that sometimes some group therapy is needed, meeting each other. There was the first phase, talk about all the negative things that are happening to us, and quite soon afterwards we saw the optimism that many fundraisers have. Okay, so what next? And we decided to start organizing some webinars around different topics, because it's always great to talk about perspectives and opportunities that are out there to think about all the important work that needs to do. And as HVFC, we love to facilitate that, because what we do is we help organizations to diversify their funding and increase their fundraising results. And so often we work one-on-one with organizations, but yeah, working together in groups makes it a lot more efficient. And we also learn from the participants. So I also hope that the participants share their ideas and questions and recommendations with the group, so we'll learn.
Okay, thank you, Han. Sharad, indeed, as Hans said, you are the main guest of our webinar today. I'll just hand over to you to introduce yourself and to also tell us all about disaster philanthropy and the work you do at CDP. Over to you, Sharad.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Such a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you, Han and Kenneth, for the invitation. I think I've known you both for about 5 to 10 years now. I think, Han, we first met in Bangladesh probably in 2015. So yeah, almost 10 years ago. And Kenneth, yeah, a couple of years working together at BRAC. So really appreciate the opportunity to re-engage and share a little bit about what I've been learning since I left BRAC and have now joined the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. So I'm Sharad Aggarwal, Vice President for Fund Management and Coalition Building. My pronouns are he, him. I've been with CDP since March of last year. I'm based in New York, but CDP is a fully remote organization. We have about 35 staff who are US based, but work remotely. And CDP provides assistance, which I'll go into more detail on with my slide deck, around the world. So not just in international setting, not just in the US base, but everywhere around the world where there are critical disaster-related issues taking place. So yeah, should I jump into the slide deck, kind of? Would that be good?
Yes,
okay,
please
let
go
me do
ahead.
that. Let me share my screen. A moment. Sorry, it seems to have disappeared. Sorry, there we are. Okay. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can. If you
Okay,
can
let me
put
go
it
into
on.
slideshow mode. Okay, so this is a brief introduction. Hopefully it won't take more than 5 or 10 minutes, but I think it's good to kind of give a summary of essentially who we are, what we do, a little bit about my particular portfolio, and then some data. Data is always a good way to start a conversation, and CDP kind of really looks to kind of research, find evidence to really support the arguments it wants to make in the area of disaster philanthropy. So CDP, our mission is to leverage the power of philanthropy to mobilize a full range of resources that strengthen the ability of communities to withstand disasters and recover equitably when they occur. So we're an intermediary, we're a philanthropy serving organization, really to kind of focus and push philanthropy to do more giving in the recovery space rather than, truly in the relief space. We do a few different things with our work. So we have a core programmatic focus around providing essentially educational services to anybody who wants to learn more about disasters, recovery issues, and how they might engage more with those particular issues. So those are essentially free services we provide. We have a lot of content on our website. We attend sessions like this, webinars, and other speaking engagements. And we always are available to kind of follow up with interested parties around just sharing more information about what we're learning and seeing and hearing. My particular area of work is around fund management and grant making and coalition building. So as an intermediary, we receive funds from a range of different philanthropists, and they essentially entrust those funds with us to then on-grant to community-level actors around the world who are providing recovery services. A growing area of my work is around coalition building also, and I'll talk more about this. The one that's most mature right now is our work around local humanitarian leadership in the international setting, but we are exploring other ways to kind of either affiliate ourselves with or lead more coalition building activities. And then another area of our work is also around advisory services. So we support essentially philanthropy with providing kind of strategic consulting, specific services that really help them in their movement towards more effective disaster giving. So specifically in my grant making portfolio, which is the largest of my portfolios, we have a few principles with which we operate. So again, really focusing on recovery and building resilience, heavy focus on the localization agenda, which can also then include support to local partners, capacity strengthening, community-led approaches, and supporting leadership and financing. CDP, in the last several years, but 2024 figures show that 78% of our funding went directly to local and national actors, which is quite a significant amount. And then all of our work is done with an equity lens, so very much prioritizing and focusing on marginalized and at-risk populations who, as we know, are the most disproportionately affected by disasters when they happen. So we have a particular keen emphasis on working with groups that are led by marginalized populations, and then the populations that they serve are also marginalized. One of the things that we talk about with CDP, and I'll get into this more with the Q&A, is that the way we want to talk about disasters is very much that really all funders are disaster funders. So, the devastating impacts of disasters are multidimensional, but they also demand multidimensional responses. And at the same time, vulnerabilities, if they are addressed early on in the process, even through community development approaches, can actually reduce the impact of disasters. So we really want to be kind of supporting that mind shift in terms of how philanthropy and people in general think about disasters. I'll go a little bit into the data. So about every 2 years, we work with an organization called Candid in the United States that essentially does a lot of research and kind of consulting work in the philanthropic space, and work with them to really understand what is the state of disaster philanthropy, where is the money, where is it going, how much, and to what types of services. So we see here, this is the most recent report that was issued in 2024, and it's based on publicly available data in the US, primarily from US philanthropy. Going back to 2022, it shows that of the almost $130 billion in private giving, only 1.4% actually went to disasters, only 1.7 billion. So there's a particular need to increase that funding overall. Also looking at this historically over the last 10 years, 2012 to 2022, a significant increase in philanthropic giving for what is a disaster response, which is COVID-19 in the year 2020. So a massive spike, and also I'll talk later about the implications and the changes that meant to kind of philanthropy and its support to communities. What we also see is a significant drop-off in funding after 2020, but still a steady increase, even though it's minimal in terms of support from philanthropy to disasters in general. We go a little bit deeper and look at the types of kind of responses that philanthropy is supporting. It still is heavily focused on relief funding. So the work that has happening in the immediate days after a crisis has happened. What CDP is trying to encourage also is more dollars being invested in other aspects of disaster response and recovery programming, which are very much around long-term recovery, and especially now even more so around preparedness. We see this is very much underfunded by a range of different donors, but especially philanthropy, and we are encouraging more investments on those areas. Couple of other slides here, and then we can move to Q&A. So one interesting thing is just to look at the types of disasters that philanthropy is funding. We saw in 2022 quite an increase in support for complex humanitarian emergencies in particular, and that was led by the efforts to support the response in Ukraine. One thing that we've seen through our research is disaster giving often happens across three different kind of factors. One is the scale of the disaster, another is the proximity of the disaster, and then the third one is the attention that the disaster is getting. So we definitely did see in 2022 significant increase for the Ukraine response, but what we also have seen in preliminary data is a significant decrease in philanthropic giving for the Ukraine response after 2022. And then final slide for now in terms of the data. One of the promising aspects of what we're seeing is that there is more giving going directly to local organizations. So the Candid data from 2022 also shows that of the grant dollars that were given from essentially US philanthropy again to non-US recipients, 2 in every 5 kind of dollars were going directly to those local organizations. So that's nice. It shows an increase above the kind of grand bargain commitments of 25%. Still not enough. CDP is at close to 80%, but it's a good growing trend. And yeah, can certainly talk more about that soon. So yeah, thank you. And then looking forward to our discussion. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Sharad. That was really some rich and very interesting data that you shared. Maybe just, you said something interesting, like basically for CDP, everyone is a disaster philanthropist. And then why distinguish specifically disaster philanthropy?
Oh, why distinguish specifically? Because there are still particular kind of nuances around the type of programming that needs to be supported in the time of a disaster. Even for CDP, a lot of our work is reactive to specific disasters that are happening. But what we're really trying to do is kind of make it clearer, that bridge between specific sudden onset disasters and how we can support longer term recovery. So yeah, and it's also the way that we want to kind of grow the tent essentially by having more philanthropists think about how their work, even though they might not be thinking about, oh, my investments really do support disasters. If you are investing in vulnerabilities, like reducing vulnerabilities, that will help to reduce the impact of a disaster when it happens. So, some donors do have kind of very kind of specific disaster portfolios, disaster giving strategies, and some don't. So what we're really trying to do is kind of broaden the scope for essentially all of philanthropy to be thinking about how their giving can really make a difference when a disaster does happen.
Right, right. And can you tell us something about the profile of those philanthropists? As I understand, they're mostly US based, but are they foundations? Are they individuals?
Yeah, for the data that I was sharing, most of them are foundations, but it's a range of different kind of donors. A lot of the data that Candid provides is from those donors that are providing funds that are in the $10,000 grant level or larger. So some slightly larger areas of giving. Yeah, it's kind of hard to kind of really say who they are in terms of a profile. One of the exercises that we're going through CDP is really trying to understand, are there particular archetypes or personas to different donors, and can that help us to understand, giving motivations better? But another thing that we talk about within CDP is that essentially every philanthropist is different. So, one of the things that we'd say basically is that if you've met a philanthropist, you've just met a philanthropist. There are very many different reasons why, philanthropists will give funding for particular motivations in different ways. So yeah, it really does kind of behoove ourselves to really be very specific, to really understand those motivations. But certainly, that varies when you're talking about a large institutional foundation versus individuals. Gathering that data across a range of individuals is much harder.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a range of different philanthropy that we work with. CDP in particular works a lot closely with corporate philanthropy, in addition to kind of more institutional philanthropy and individual donors.
Yeah. So you're working mostly with US-based philanthropists, different profiles. You also showed us that the trend is moving upwards in terms of the volume. Han, this is mainly US. Can you maybe also say something about how is that for Europe, the continent where we mostly focus on? Do we see a similar trend in terms of philanthropic giving?
Well, it reminds me a bit what you were saying, Sharad. On a previous webinar we organized a few months ago with Vilea, the umbrella of European foundations, where we had Delphine Morales, the CEO. And you were saying, if you know one foundation in the US, you only know one. She exactly said the same thing about European foundations. Often we are looking for this one trick, this one type of engaging with donors to be extremely successful, but it is a one by one kind of exercise, and that's and there the Europe is slightly more difficult to compare, because you indeed have Candid in the US, where pretty much all of the information of the foundations is there. In Europe, we don't have such a thing, unfortunately. So we do know about individual foundations, for some at least, that how much they contribute, but nothing really comparable. What we can do, of course, is look at the institutional donors and the governments, and see how they contribute. And there you see a little bit the opposite of what you were just showing, Sharad, is that the numbers are much higher. So the 1.7 billion that is available for disaster philanthropy in the US, that's from foundations. That is a too small number, of course, and it's good to see that it's going up every year a bit. If you compare that with the institutional donors, the amounts are much higher. But it's also a lot under pressure, as we know. We saw it in the US, we see it in the Netherlands, where I'm from, we see it in Germany, France. ODA is under pressure. Good news is that of all the sectors that are being cut, the humanitarian sector is cut the least. And my feeling behind it is that, especially when we talk about disaster support, disaster relief, is that there's not one person to blame. There's not a root cause. It just happens, and we need to deal with it. There's a disaster, or there's an epidemic disease, or we just have to act. And that's an appeal on our human behavior. That's on our humankind, and that's why you see normally governments making budget available for this and acting really fast. And apart from the fact that the amounts are relatively high compared to the foundation funding still, although the trend is moving into the other direction a little bit, Compared to other procedures that you normally have with governments, the appeal procedures are much faster, and that's one of the reasons that disaster organizations love to work with governments. It's so like sometimes if we review a proposal, for example, we really look at the dots and the commas, and the spelling makes a huge difference if you win or lose. If there's a disaster, as speed is more important, and how you present it is less important. And so it's much faster. And apart from the funding, you can often also use the ecosystem of the government, so the embassies or the other partners to work with. So that's definitely something that is going to stay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We've also recently, of course, seen the demise of USAID or USAID in the US, but also other budget cuts worldwide, not just here in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world. I mean, both of you, but maybe start with you, Sharad. What do you think is the dwindling ODA? Do you think philanthropists are and can step in to fill that gap? What is your expectation?
Yeah, that is the topic of conversation these days, isn't it? Certainly the kind of surprising and very fast reduction in development assistance coming not just from the US, but other countries around the world, but also then the call to philanthropy to step in. The reality is philanthropy has always stepped in, right? Philanthropic giving is already and always has been meeting gaps that are, there when there are other failures, whether from the market or from the public sector. So this isn't anything new. I think it's really a question of scale and for how long can kind of philanthropy make a difference in this time of kind of newly kind of determined need. What we're seeing, or kind of what we're really hoping for, is that philanthropy just stays true to itself, its values. What has been nice to see in philanthropy is more of a recognition of the kind of historical roots of philanthropy and how more needs to be done in terms of shifting power dynamics. So kind of reinforcing that call to philanthropy to stay true to those kind of principles and values of how philanthropy should be operating, and continuing to support those institutions that are going to be very affected if they've not already been affected by these funding cuts. And those are especially, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations that, either directly from the government or through kind of intermediaries who are heavily dependent on public funding. So philanthropy has supported them. So philanthropy we really are encouraging will continue to support them. And really, we have seen some philanthropy kind of shift their giving practices. So MacArthur Foundation increased their targets for giving from 5%, which is kind of the statutory minimum, to now 6%. They're also moving in new exciting ways in terms of how they're structuring their funding. We're of course aware of the Gates Foundation and their decision to kind of accelerate their sunset on their existence. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Freedom Together Foundation, Kellogg Foundation have all kind of responded in different ways to really, it might sound prosaic, but meet the moment. A lot of people are talking about that also. And then Bloomberg Philanthropy is kind of really coming in, kind of staying true to its commitment to climate change activities, being willing to now kind of contribute more in that space, given US and other donors kind of reduction in that. So there are kind of good kind of examples that we have there. I wouldn't expect for kind of a broad-based kind of shift to kind of expedite or kind of significantly increase giving. Some data points out there, if you look at them, really show that even in the United States, if all of US philanthropy kind of liquidated all of their endowments and investments right now, would only take you to kind of less than 80 days into the federal fiscal year in terms of how much money is actually provided by federal public funding. So it wouldn't be meaningful, right? So then what can then philanthropy do to kind of continue to stay true to kind of its work around systems change, catalyzing activities, piloting interventions, and then working with those populations that are kind of traditionally left out of other kind of giving, especially public funding, and now will be kind of feeling kind of more challenges in terms of cutbacks. So yeah, that's kind of really what we're seeing and kind of hoping for in terms of philanthropic practice now.
Yeah. Han, maybe any views from your end? How do you see that for philanthropy in Europe, stepping into the budget cuts in ODA budgets?
Well, we have fewer of these super large foundations in Europe. So we have many, in absolute numbers, we have more foundations than in the US, but in total giving, it's lower. So what you see is that we have many relative small foundations, and that makes it a bit more difficult for them to fill this gap. And from a fundraising perspective, that means that you need to target many different donors, and that means that the whole building the trust between you and the donor, and to make your story compelling and makes it a bit more challenging. It is definitely possible. My introduction in the sector as in fundraising was actually the tsunami disaster. When the tsunami hit Asia and parts of Africa, what I did is I was hired by this organization to study the philanthropic actions that were taking place in the Netherlands afterwards. And it was the largest fundraising success still. 200 million was raised, over 200 million euros were raised in that campaign. And that was by targeting individuals for €5 or €50, by targeting foundations to do 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, by targeting companies to contribute 50,000, 100,000, relatively small amounts, but many of them, everyone was supporting it. And then such a gap can be filled. The consequence of this is, how can you convince so many donors to fund you? And one of the effects was that in the communication, things were being said like, if you give us money, we are going to spend it 100% correctly. Those types of claims were being made, and that's of course very challenging well, if not impossible, in the case of disaster relief. So, but interesting enough, that never had an effect on the giving of people and organizations afterwards. They still contribute, so they take their responsibility, like Sharad was saying. If they have the ability to fund the gap, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the tsunami, but I think there's been many other examples afterwards. What would you say, Han, if giving takes place at such a large scale? There also has to be some what we call trust-based philanthropy.
Yeah.
And we talked about this topic a couple of weeks ago in one of our other webinars. But Han, maybe you want to elaborate also a bit about trust-based philanthropy and how that relates, maybe in particular also to disasters, in which the motive for giving is very much in the moment, and it's very much an emotional trigger to give.
Definitely, yeah. So in this webinar, we had Professor Dr. Pamela Wiepken of the Free University in the Netherlands, and Lily University in Indianapolis, I think. But I'm not 100% sure, but in the US. And she explained the different models of getting unrestricted funding for an organization, or organizational funding, I have to say, with the holy grail, the funding coming from trust. So a donor gives to you without any preconditions, with any strings attached, and in the sector, and there's a challenge. That's I think the main conclusion of the webinar. It's a challenge. There are not so many donors that fund under the principles of trust-based philanthropy, although everyone can imagine that it has more effect. But in the case of disaster philanthropy, there's no data behind it. But what we see in practice is donors are going much quicker. They are a lot less on conditions. They accept that there is room for failure, but we just need to act. So there's a lot more trust. That is a good thing that as an organization, what you can do is convince donors that you are a trustworthy party by being honest, by being transparent, by being complete in your communication, work on your reputation. The downside of this is that for the local organizations, and I was impressed by seeing the 40% of funding that goes from the US to local organizations, that is more a challenge, because how do you, as a local organization, connect with an organization you don't know and build at that level that so much trust is being built that they are going to contribute significant amounts. And so that's a challenge. But well, if you have a good vehicle in between, a European NGO, for example, that can accept on behalf of you and distribute again, then it can definitely work. Yeah.
How do you, at CDP, Sharad, how do you deal with that, like the trust question? You know, speed, of course, is of the essence, but at the same time, you also need to make sure that the money is spent, you know, in accordance with what it's destined for.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an exciting kind of trend in philanthropy. Kind of going back to what I was saying before about, you know, philanthropy really recognizing that there are very real power imbalances in how it traditionally has worked, and can it really operationalize things differently? Still kind of not fully eliminating those power balances, but kind of changing processes, mechanisms to really bring more kind of power to the grant recipients, right, in that conversation around funding. So for CDP, we do a few different things. One is that we have in the last 3 years gone through 2 different exercises with a partner named the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And we've done our grantee perception report. So essentially, we will survey between 180 to 250 grantee partners every 2 years that we've directly funded, and gone through. It's a pretty lengthy survey, about 45 minutes to complete. Ask a range of different questions around essentially all aspects of their relationship of working with CDP. So we did this initially in 2022, and the feedback we took and actually made changes in our grant practices. So things like streamlining our application documents, making sure there was more communication taking place from program officers at CDP to prospective grantee partners, being willing to be more flexible in the funding and the budgeting that we're expecting from grantee partners. So a lot of changes, and we have it on our website, the whole process that we went through there. But we didn't leave it at that. You know, then in 2024, we went back to all of the more recent cohort of grantee partners, which included previous grantees, and said, okay, you know, similar survey process with CEP, but how did we do? How did we kind of implement those changes? Did you feel, you know, a difference in those new changes? What are the new experiences or challenges you're having that CDP can continue to evolve around? And so we're in the midst right now of, you know, reviewing those recommendations and continuing to kind of make perhaps smaller changes this time around, since the ones 2 years ago were more significant. But yeah, certainly making more changes in terms of how we can continue to be an effective, responsible grantor. One of the things that differentiates us as an intermediary from other foundations is that we are still accountable to our donors. We don't have our own endowment. So there are certain limitations that we have in terms of being able to kind of very openly give full what we call my God dollars, so multi-year general operating dollars. So we still have to be accountable to our donors for the funds that we commit in terms of grantee partner investments. But we are flexible. We have for the first time this year, actually considered starting to give multi-year general operating dollars in the right situation to the right partner who we have a trusted relationship with. And we think as a partner will really support the growth of kind of civil society infrastructure in that particular community context. What we see is often there's just weak capacity or infrastructure there to actually manage recovery programming because of underinvestment, not because of lack of effort, but because of underinvestment. So can we identify a small handful of particular partners that we can provide these more flexible dollars to, and really think about an organizational commitment to them that they will be there for the long term, and really be able to invest in their organizational growth, the capacity building that they need to do, the research that they need to do, and not have to worry about reporting against any particular grant outcomes on our recovery effort. So still exploring that right now, but I'm really hoping that we'll be able to have good movement there. And ultimately, with trust-based philanthropy, it's a range of different principles. So I think a lot of attention does get placed on those multi-year general operating dollars, which are a very big part of it, but a lot of it is about just shifting those power dynamics, responsiveness, ownership from the grantor in terms of their relationship, understanding the communities and not expecting communities to be the ones translating their experiences, but really making the effort as a grantor to understand and be culturally sensitive. And then the biggest one, like you were talking about, Han, is, the accountability. How do you make sure you manage that level of accountability there? And there are some donors who are really shifting their approach to accountability by not necessarily looking at what's the community level impact, but what's the impact on the grantee level. And so that's a conversation that has to happen within every boardroom and every kind of like senior management team within a philanthropy to really say, are we okay with that? But that's an exciting trend also that's happening. Trying to think if there's anything else there. Yep. That's probably
Yeah,
good.
that's great
I
you
picked
mentioned
up
this.
on two things that I, oh, sorry,
Uh-huh.
you wanted
No, I
to.
just wanted to reflect because I was at an event last Tuesday where there was the CEO of a large Dutch foundation, and he mentioned that most of their grantees are grantees they know. They come back every year, or every time there's an issue, they can come back, sometimes several times per year. But because they want to be certain that the money is well spent, there are all kinds of rules, regulations, application forms that are complicated, and then recently they did a check on. They hired someone to assess in how many cases we had a fraudulent case. So everything that they've set up to prevent fraudulent cases to happen, and they've assessed the last 5,000 grants. They found one case. So they've decided, you know what? Why make it complicated for the 4,999 others? And maybe 5 or 10 of them are also being missed by doing that check. So they're extremely clever, but why bother the others? And they just made processes so much easier, and the fund based on trust now. Not that an unknown organization all of a sudden gets, a big chunk of money. No, we start small, we grow over the years, but eventually, that's you can grow into this multi-year kind of partnership with very relaxed conditions. And I think that's also for the humanitarian organizations. If you can really build on your reputation and you're clear on where your strengths are, but also where your weaknesses are. If you report back to the donor what went well, what maybe didn't go as well as expected, the trust is being built, and you will see next time it will go smoother and easier. That's yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add also, we saw a lot of this more kind of trust-based approach happening in the early days of COVID. A lot of giving from philanthropy was in this kind of general operating manner, just to understand and respond to that things were uncertain, right? So you can't place kind of unnatural kind of certainty on an uncertain time. So yeah, a lot of philanthropic giving then kind of really did kind of move towards that general operating support, especially for populations and community groups that were disproportionately affected. And then, when the funding cuts happened earlier this year in February, we reached out, a blanket email to all of our grantee partners to say, we can't necessarily increase our giving right now, but we can be flexible. So if you are seeing that you need time extensions, modifications to budgets, don't hesitate at all. Come to us and we'll make sure that, we can respond very quickly to give you that flexibility, at least allow you some kind of opportunity to kind of be kind of creative with the funding for the next several months until you know more, given that kind of very kind of immediate uncertainty that was happening in February or March of this year. So so there are efforts that you can make, may not be kind of long-term kind of sustainable changes, but just really listening to what your grantee partners need at the moment can go a really, really long way. So we've tried to do that a little bit.
Yeah. Speaking of long term, Sharad, it's disaster philanthropy, but do you think, is disaster philanthropy, and can they also move beyond the immediate disaster, let's say, response and work on the longer term for recovery, working on issues like weak governance or poor infrastructure? Is that all, and is that something also that you see that donors are interested in at CDP or when they work with CDP?
Yeah, I mean, this is the reason for our existence, and this is our kind of overriding goal is to encourage philanthropy to be more responsive to disasters, but really about long-term recovery and to address root causes. So kind of going back to one of my slides around, all funders being disaster funders. One of the other slides I didn't include was something that we just do to kind of, in very simple terms, break down what is a disaster. A disaster is when a hazard meets a vulnerability. And so there can be vulnerabilities from root causes like systemic inequities and power inequities. Also things like, pressures like urbanization, lack of press freedom, poor building codes, disease prevalence, and those are also vulnerabilities. So when you look at a disaster and only look at the event, the extreme weather event, like a hurricane or a flood or the war or the conflict, you forget or don't pay adequate attention to the vulnerability. So what we really try to kind of lift up is it's this combination of the two. And as philanthropy or really any funder or donor, any actor who's interested in this, who wants to kind of build community capacity, respond to disasters, make sure the time between disasters and recovery is shortened, really focus on that vulnerability component. So I think encouraging that kind of analytical framework to what a disaster is and how you can support communities at whatever trajectory they are, whether they're kind of heading into a disaster or coming out of a disaster or don't even kind of expect to have a disaster, how can you support them? So one of the recent examples we had here in the United States was around Hurricane Helene. It affected Western North Carolina, immensely, significant loss of life, property damage. It'll be, decades until that region is completely recovered. But it was also seen as a community that was probably, perceived to be a climate haven, right? And that changed very quickly. So with more preparedness investments, more thinking about how can we support communities that have, already existing challenges. So one of the big challenges existing in Western North Carolina prior to Helene was just kind of limited availability of affordable housing. So there were already challenges there. So can there be better investments in just those things that are just good community development? So when disasters, shocks happen, they aren't as impactful, but also the kind of ability for a community to kind of recover, less reliant on external resources can also kind of be increased. We've also seen the challenges with things like insurance industry kind of just not being available to provide good kind of first line of defense in terms of insurance claims in these types of situations. So are there other more kind of systemic investments that philanthropy can make to really support that. So yeah, certainly there is that role for philanthropy, especially in terms of supporting preparedness, mitigation, adaptation activities, but especially long-term recovery. What CDP does a lot in our work is that we support grantee partners in a post-disaster context to be thinking about how can they prevent, or not, maybe not prevent, but minimize the impact of the next disaster that's going to happen, right? So can we actually emphasize that even more than just the kind of immediate disaster response, which is expensive, doesn't support human dignity, and really is, devastating for lives. So yeah, how can we shift that mindset also in terms of what's a better investment?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe my last question before you, sorry, Han, you wanted to.
If we talk about the addresses of the root causes, I spotted an opportunity, and maybe it's not really an opportunity, but I do want to share it with everyone. So yesterday I was in the car, and I had a fundraising event, and I was in the car for 2.5 hours. And so I had the radio on. I was thinking about this webinar a bit, and on the radio they were talking about the NATO summit and the conclusions of the NATO summit. And you probably all saw it, but the NATO countries have committed to spend 5% of their GDP, gross domestic product, to military expenses. But 3.5% is for the military, and 1.5% is for supporting activities. And that's where I think the opportunity is, because I think if we as a humanitarian sector go to our governments and say, hey, you know what, there is 1.5% budget that you can spend on us for us to deal with the root causes of epidemics or disasters, climate change, those types of things. If we can spend part of that 1.5% on addressing those root causes, you can go back to the NATO and say, I've spent all my money, but actually you've worked on prevention. And that's not something that just that hasn't happened before. If you look at how we know each other, again, it's from the tuberculosis control. A long time ago, we worked in tuberculosis control, both of us. A lot of the inventions came from the US military. They saw the risk of a tuberculosis outbreak in the world. The military saw the risk, or any epidemic. They invest heavily in protecting the world from epidemics to happen. So it does happen already. So if we just rethink and we reposition ourselves a little bit, I think there are all kinds of opportunities. But I'm not sure, but I think we should give it a try.
Thank you, Han. I mean, speaking, and this is my last question before we move to the Q&A. Speaking of opportunities, and Sharad, I think our participants are also very keen to hear. You dropped some terms that I think resonate with us very well. Operating dollars, flexi funding. We love those terms. I mean, can anyone apply to CDP if, provided they meet criteria, and that there is, I mean, are there any country restrictions, or do you do not work with unsolicited proposals, or how
So
does?
yeah, I can touch briefly on that, and certainly can share more materials after, this through your audience, in terms of our grant making practices. But in a nutshell, we do only work through invitation process only. So essentially what happens is, mostly in our reactive kind of post-disaster into recovery grant making, we'll conduct our own assessments of the disaster context, understand what funding we have available based on which donors have given funding to us as an intermediary to then on grant. And then just really have a conversation with either known or, yet to be connected with community level partners. So as I mentioned before, we do want to be working as closely to the kind of community level as possible. So those trusted organizations that are going to be there before and after a disaster, and really know that the community's challenges and, assets and opportunities too. So we go through this process, and because we don't focus on immediate relief, that we do focus on recovery, we actually have that time to do that more kind of intense kind of focused due diligence work on really understanding who are those partners and those issues that really do need attention, especially looking at marginalized populations. And then we'll just kind of essentially look at our funding available and determine, which partners would we like to work with based on initial conversations, and then invite them to apply. Most of our grant dollars, if you look at it over the last several years, have been in the range of about less than $250,000 per grant. But we've also seen an increase in the number of new grantee partners we work with, because that's also an effort that we want to make, is not only to be working with the same grantee partners over and over again. Yeah, so that's essentially the grant making approach. Another thing that we do by a different team at CDP is that we work in our kind of advisory services process, where we work with clients such as donor advised funds, and based on their kind of donors, they are often wanting to come up with lists of responding organizations that are actually doing more of the relief work. They will come to CDP as a trusted partner for us to kind of provide them a list of responding organizations. So we will also then, be gathering information, and this is usually for either the larger international NGOs or the multi-state organizations in the US that have, a higher level of kind of reach and capacity. And so we have an ongoing process where we essentially do a due diligence, vetting of them. And then when a disaster is happening, we will reach out to them, find out if they're responding. They can also reach out to us, and then we'll kind of curate a list and pass that along to the DAF or other client partner. And then it's up to them, to really determine would they like to give. So those funds won't pass through us. But I think last year alone, through one of the DAFs, they were able to kind of essentially credit CDP for about, I believe, if I'm not wrong, and I can find the figure later on, about $175 million worth of grant making that went to partners that were on CDP lists. So yeah, there are other ways that CDP supports funding, even if it is indirectly. But yeah, through our direct grant making, it is very much based on this invitation to apply process. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Sharad. I think it's time now to move to the Q&A.